and welcome to my channel. So before we start this video, I'd just like to say during this video I will be attempting to pronounce some Swedish names, and for that I am truly sorry. So this video is all about the Sture Murders. King Erik XIV of Sweden was born on the 13th of December 1533. He was the son of Gustav I of Sweden and Catherine of Saxe-Lauenburg. So Erik was intelligent and he knew his own mind, but he was also a very suspicious person. So when Erik became king, he had big plans for Sweden. He saw Sweden as a superpower and he wanted to make this so by expanding Sweden's territory. So when Erik left to go to war to expand his territories, instead of leaving the Privy Council that was made up of the nobles of Sweden in charge as what would have been the norm, he instead dismissed the Privy Council and left his trusted advisor Johan Persson in charge. He also dismissed all the nobles that held positions in the High Court and gave the role of senior prosecutor to Johan as well. So the wars that Erik were going on were not cheap. Wars never are. And to pay for these wars, Erik wanted the nobles to do it. But the nobles said no. Why should they pay for these wars when Erik had dismissed them from office? So the suspicious Erik actually convinced himself that the reason the nobles were not going to give him money towards his wars was not because they were peeved about his treatment of them, but because they were traitors. So he had hundreds of people dragged into torture chambers to be interrogated. And in 5 years, 300 of these people that he had interrogated were sentenced to death. Now, most of these death sentences were not carried out, but Erik had become really unpopular. One of the men who had been sentenced to death was a man called Niels Swanteson Sture. Now, Sture had been really loyal to Erik and he had actually fought on Erik's behalf. But Erik had become convinced that Sture's intentions were evil and he really hated him. So Erik often looked to astrologers for guidance. And when one of these astrologers told him that someone close to the throne wanted to snatch it from him, Erik became convinced that it was Sture that wanted to do this. So he had him arrested on charges of conspiracy to usurp the Swedish throne. Now, Sture was convinced that Erik was going to have him killed, but instead Erik had him dragged from his cell, sat on a horse and had a crown of straw placed on his head, and then he was led through the streets of Stockholm. Then, after Sture's public humiliation, everything went back to normal. Sture was back being a trusted courtier at court, and Erik trusted Sture so much that he put Sture in charge of going to Lorraine to negotiate Erik's marriage to Princess Renata. But then Erik became suspicious of Sture again. So before Sture had gone off to Lorraine, a group of nobles threw a going away party for him. And Erik became convinced that people at this party were actually plotting against him. So Sture went to Lorraine to negotiate Erik's marriage. But when Erik heard that the negotiations were not going too well, he thought that Sture was deliberately messing them up. And then, while Erik's former page Gustav Ribbin was being interrogated by torture, he said that yes, Sture was conspiring against the king. Gustav also said yes to every name the interrogators were throwing at him and also added a few more in there too. Most of these names that he had said yes to had been guessed at Sture's going away party. So all of these people that were named were arrested, and when Sture returned home he was arrested as well. But the rest of the nobles were not happy with what was going on, so Erik summoned them to a meeting to tell them what was going on. But unbeknown to those who were attending this meeting, some of them had been named by Gustav. So when they arrived at the castle where the meeting was being held, 6 of them were arrested and put on trial, including Sture's father and brother. King Erik's mental health then took a drastic turn. On the 16th of May 1567, Erik was meant to be given a speech, but he had a massive anxiety attack and ended up collapsing. He then wrote a letter to Sture saying that all charges of treason against his family were to be dropped and begged for his forgiveness. But even though he had been pardoned, Sture and his family stayed in prison. So the king really was not well, and finding him in an agitated state, his advisors told him to just take some time out for himself. But then on the 24th of May 1567, Erik heard that his half-brother John had started a rebellion and was going to take the crown from him. Erik flew into a rage, went to Sture's cell and stabbed him, leaving him for dead on the prison floor and telling the prison guards to finish him off. He then went to Sture's father's cell to beg for his forgiveness for killing his son. But then he told Sture's father that he too would have to die because he could hardly be expected to forgive his son's killer. As he left the prison area, Erik told the guard to kill every prisoner in there except a man called Sten. And the guards did as they were told. They killed Sture, his father, his brother, and two nobles who were imprisoned there too, called Abraham Stenbock and Ivar Ivarsson. Now, there was actually two prisoners called Sten in the prison, because the guards did not know which Sten the king wanted saved, they didn't kill either of them because they just didn't want to get it wrong. So after this, King Erik disappeared, so his tutor organised a search party to go look for him, and they found Erik later on wandering naked in the woods next to the castle. Seeing the search party approaching him, Erik ordered his guards to kill his tutor, and even though the guards knew that Erik was just completely insane at this point, he was actually still their king, so they did as they were told. Then on the 27th of May, dressed completely in rags, Erik returned to Stockholm and went to see his stepmother, where he confessed everything that he had done. His stepmother compensated the victims and issued posthumous pardons for them. But because the murders were legally recognised as executions, Erik went unpunished. So for the next 6 months, Sweden was ruled by the Privy Council until Erik had recovered from his mental illness. But when Erik was back being king, he committed another murder, killing his secretary, Martin Helsing. In 1568, Erik's half-brother John led a coup against him and took the throne. And then Erik stayed in prison for 9 years until 1577, when he was poisoned by soup laced with arsenic. So that is the story of the Sture Murders. Again, I apologise for any of my Swedish name pronunciations. I'm really sorry about that. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Bye.